Hey Steph, welcome back to the Your Inner Power series. It's so good to see you again.
You too, my friend. You too.
In our last conversation, we spoke about what gets in the way of your natural creativity, joy, and inspiration, and how to experience more of that good stuff. And so today, I wanted to talk about, what's the role of insight and how does it impact the idea that well-being and success are built into the human design. Because to me, I grew up with so many premises that well-being and success were results of my effort, results of my doing, results of who I was trying to become in the world. And so with that said, I'm going to throw this over to you.
Mhm. What a beautiful question. Beautiful question. So I suppose it might be useful for people listening into this to get an idea of what we mean by insight. And I think there's a uh, a good differentiation to me between insight and a good idea. In as much as a good idea is, in my mind, something that comes to us from our intellect, something that we look towards our experience in life, our database of stuff that we know, information, and we make a judgment about the pros and cons, and then we come up with a good idea based on what we already know. For me, the term insight means something that occurs to us that comes to us from a different place. Insight means a a realization or a knowing that we feel to be true, that we feel in our gut. And it might be something very simple, or it might be something about life that we've been struggling with for most of our lives. But it comes from a deeper place within us, insight, sight from within. It's not coming from our intellect. It's not coming from our analytical brain. It's coming from the intelligence behind life. So, an example for an insight for me would be, I guess, when I first came to this understanding, and I realized that, well, if thought is transient, if thought is something that comes and goes, and I don't know what I'm going to be thinking in 2 hours' time, and whatever feels important to me now and really, really meaningful for my life and hurtful, I might suffer from it in a minute, an hour, a day. I saw that I wouldn't be having the same thoughts. I would be in a different state of mind. So, seeing how thought is not quite as true as I had always believed. Culturally, that's what we're taught. We believe in our thoughts. When I first came to this understanding, I got to see how what I thought about myself, which was for many years was, I'm not good enough. You know, I can't go and talk to that girl. I can't go to that party. I can't pass that exam. There was a feeling of not good enough, which stopped me doing stuff, you know. So an example of insight for me was when I actually realized that everything that I had thought about myself, all the layers of beliefs that were kind of weighing on me so much, there was a possibility that they weren't true. Now, that went from a realization to a knowing. That went from a not an intellectual understanding. There was a feeling within me where I thought, that is just true. That I am not the person that I made myself up to be. Now, that was life-changing for me, because all of a sudden, the limitations kind of just dissolved. And it was, well, you know, maybe I can go to that party. Maybe I can go for that job. Maybe I can pass that exam. So I, through that insight, I then was standing on a different piece of ground. I was standing on from a different place. I was in prison before, and I was limited to everything that I thought that prison meant about me. And then all of a sudden, I was out of prison. So, and what that does, what insight does, is it allows us to see a different world. It allows us to stand in a different, much healthier place. And with insight, that's the only place that we get transformation, that we get a longer lasting change for our life. You know, everything else intellectually is subject to what's going through our head in that moment and our state of mind. But this, because it comes from a deeper place, is not an intellectual knowing. It's a gut knowing. And from that point, that's where transformation happens. So it's really, really useful to understand. I mean, even people who don't know this understanding will have had experience of insight. But most of us don't know what it is when it happens. Most of us don't know where to look for insight. But it's an innate capacity within all of us that is working, you know, 24/7 to help us navigate our life. So what would you say, Nikon, is your experience of insight?
That's a good question. Give me a moment. I want to take a moment and soak up everything you shared. What comes to mind is I had a very similar experience of really not thinking I was good enough for most of my life. And I think that there's a rebellious part of me that didn't want to accept that. So I went the other way. And I was like, well, if I'm not good enough, then I'm going to go down. I'm going to go down in flames trying to be good enough. So I spent a lot of money, a lot of years doing everything I could to be good enough. And that include trying to become a better person, like lots of personal development, changing my habits, trying to become what was at one point the big idea was like, who do I want to become? And I would just focus on that because if I could just become that person, I wouldn't be the piece of crap I think I am, and if I could just be better, that would solve all my problems. Not realizing that that was just taking me further and further away from the truth, which was I'm good. And I think I shared this in our last session about how when I came into this conversation, I was so upset and so frustrated that all of my efforts, previous efforts, were for naught. That like it was like, wait a minute, are you telling me that I am like all that was made up? The thought that I'm not good enough and all my efforts in trying to be good enough, that was all for naught. Like I was really, it took me a year to not be frustrated with that. And the more I settled into it and the more I saw it, and I really loved what you shared about finding solid ground with that. And then it became a knowing. And then just like that, it all that thinking just dropped out. And I realized that I'm okay. There is nothing to work on. And that in my essence of who I really am, pure energy, before form, before thought, it is untouched. And I was having a conversation with a mentee about this, and he was talking to me about healing his inner wounds and all this work he was doing on himself, and he's new. So, and I listened, and I had an insight. I had an insight, and the insight it came from within. It's just like, oh, and it was for me as much as it was for him. And I said, look, to me, you can operate under the premise that there's something wrong with you and you're unhealed and you're wounded, and you can spend a lot of time and energy trying to fix that. And you'll probably feel better. But if you're operating under that premise that like you're unhealed or you're wounded, you're always going to be trying to fix stuff. And I'd like to point to something different. If who you really are is untouched by thought, and who you really are is pure, creative, infinite potential, there's nothing to heal and there's nothing to fix. And from that space, you will do great things because there's less in the way. There's more of that space for natural well-being to come through, for things to work out in what we would describe as success. And I really saw that. And by the end of that whatever I was saying was more for me than it was for this mentee, but I saw it fresh. I was like, oh wow, this is capital T truth in that where we're operating from. And this to me is the role of insight that in a split second, it can change my whole world. And it doesn't require me to be like, no one is worthy of insight because insight is for everybody. And that's what I saw to that. And even as I share this to you, I'm reliving that. And and it's such a wonderful feeling. And can you imagine how wonderful it is, Steph, if we really, really saw that no one is worthy of well-being and success because it's already built in. You can't do anything to be worthy of something that was already God-given, that was already built into the system. What a wonderful insight. I'm going to throw this back to you.
That's absolutely beautiful. That really, really resonates. I think there's something about understanding, and this goes back to the built-in design for well-being and success, whatever success means for us. There's something about understanding the beauty and the kindness of the design because we come out into this world and we spend most of our lives thinking that we're responsible, that we have to make our own way by our own intelligence, our own courage. And that's a really lonely place. That's one aspect of the misunderstanding about separation. About how we're not a part of the universe, that we're somehow alone and afraid, which is where, you know, a lot of that not good enough comes from. So this understanding for me, and another way that it turned everything round, was I realized that we have the intelligence of life within us. We have a navigation system that will allow us to course correct. It'll allow us to try stuff out. But we will always end up, like on the GPS, you know, back on track. We have the free will to do anything we want along the way, including, you know, kind of getting caught up and go off the path for a while. But that navigation system, that compass, always brings us back to true north. And that is the direction of well-being and success. You know, success as in contentment and fulfillment and ease. We aren't alone in this. We have the intelligence of life to guide us.
What do you make of the idea that the intelligence of life is innately guiding us to well-being and success?
I see in my own life that the deeper dimension of us, the part of us that is before the intellect, the part of us where the intelligence of life resides, it has qualities for me. It seems to me that it overall is this love, not just as in an emotion or a feeling, but love unconditional. And within that unconditional love, there is kindness, compassion, understanding, forgiveness, but also within that deeper dimension, there is passion, there is aliveness, there is inspiration, you know, there is hope, there is possibility. And I think when we live more from that place, when we touch that space, it naturally propels us towards well-being and success. It naturally propels us towards a more meaningful, richer experience of life, where everything is a miracle. That's how it feels to me, that when we understand how it works and we can call on that deeper part of us, we naturally are oriented in the direction of love and aliveness and meaning and beauty and miracles. That's what I've seen.
What occurs to me is that quote from that movie, How Harry Met Sally, like, I will have what she's having. Yes, please. I will take one of those and one to go home. What occurs to me is a story. A couple months back, I was asked by a dear friend who runs a couple of restaurants and cafes in Bangkok, and I was asked to coach her executive chef because this was one of his first positions as head chef, and that was a very trendy up and coming restaurant. And she noticed that the chef was putting a lot of stress and pressure on himself, and he was squeezing the life out of himself. He was squeezing the creativity out of himself. He was squeezing the insight out of himself. So I was asked to come in, and we really had a couple conversations, I would say 4 max. And so I was like, well, what did you do? It's like, well, I think what he got most out of it is he relaxed more into himself. And as imagine someone taking their own hand off their own neck, and he could breathe again. And he had more insights on what to do and how to be a leader and what to cook and ideas. Like his creativity was flowing. He started to sleep better. And soon enough, chef, within, I would say 3 months, the restaurant started to hit their targets, their monthly financial goals and targets. I would say within 6 months, they started to get on magazines and a lot of good PR. And soon after that, I think they won an award for one of the best new restaurants in town. Now, if you ask me, so Nikon, like, do you know a lot about restaurants and about chefs to coach this person? No, not at all. I watch a lot of Gordon Ramsay shows. Like, I don't know if that counts, but I know what I'm pointing to. And I know about the power of what we're talking about, the role and insight, and about how this power can and will guide you to your innate well-being and success if you let it. And I love the way you use your the metaphor of a GPS, because you're free to tell the GPS to fuck off too. Like, that's also available. And I think most of the time we don't know we're doing that. We just think we're being responsible, we're being aware. Because I could tell when I first met this chef, he was micromanaging and controlling and hanging on for dear life. And he told me, like, well, I'm just like that. And I told him, like, that's not true. And because I told him that, when you're insecure and you're afraid, you tend to want to control things. You want to minimize your world to make it look small enough for you to control. Mm. And I'm here to show you that you don't really need to do that. Mm. What about you, Steph? What occurs to you?
Well, what occurs to me is I had an experience when I was in my teens. No, I might have shared before, but I'm going to say it again. So in my late teens, I had an experience when my mum died, and it was very painful for me. She was my best friend, you know, she was my guru, and yeah, when she died, it was very, very difficult for me. A couple of years later, I had the opportunity to become a professional musician, which, because I was never good enough, I would never allow myself to even entertain the idea. And so I was asked to go to an audition for this band that was, you know, sort of working all over the world and stuff. And there was never a moment where I would have considered myself good enough to actually become professional. And this is a really good example of how the intelligence behind life, the intelligence behind the system is always working, whether I understand it or not. Because at that time, I was asked to go to this audition, which I would never have ever considered. I wouldn't have wanted to be embarrassed. But a thought came to me, an insight came to me. And the insight was, do you know what? You have just spent the last 2 years going through the most difficult time in your life. Deeply, deeply, deeply challenging for me. And that is possibly the worst thing that could ever happen to you in your life. So what's so difficult about going to an audition? What's the worst that can happen? All of a sudden, I began to get this huge perspective on it. And it was literally, well, fuck it. Whatever happens, fuck it. And that insight changed my life, because I went to the audition, I passed, and I spent the next 5 years kind of traveling and earning a living as a musician all over the world. And my passion for traveling and meeting people and music is still here. That's something that's been feeding me and nourishing me my whole life. So there are so many instances in my life that I can point to where I've been on some sort of, I've been stuck. I've been on some sort of limited idea of what was possible, of what life had to offer. And when I look back, it's only been insight, a deep, deep knowing that changes how I've seen things, that has made the difference. And so often, so much beauty, so much love and inspiration has come from that place. It is the biggest gift that I can imagine that we get to share with the people that we speak to, is to know that really we are not who we think we are, and we are not limited by what we think we're limited by. Anything is possible. We don't have the imagination of the intelligence behind life. We need to allow it in.
Felt every word. I love that quote of we are not who we think we are. And it begs the question of, well, who are we really? And that's the perfect place to put a pin on it, because that's going to be the topic for the next session, the next and final session of the deeper dimension of who we are and our true unlimited potential. And with that said, I'm going to say thank you very much, Stef, for your presence, your experience, your stories, and pointing us to insight. Bless you, Stef.
Bless you, Nikon. Thank you for your own wisdom, your own sharing, and I see so much more every time we speak.
I'm happy we record these because they're really good. And with that said, I'm going to stop recording and we will see you in the next session. All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.